Well, good evening, and we appreciate all those that are listening in tonight. This is the last presentation on our Wednesday night summer series, and we appreciate you being online and joining with us tonight. Tonight, our last speaker is Dr. Bruce McLarty. Dr. McLarty is president of Harding University. Many of you know him, but some of the things about him that you might find interesting. He was originally born in Nashville, Tennessee. He went to Harding Academy. He got his education. He went further his education at Harding University, which he graduated in 1978. His wife, Ann, graduated in 1980. Dr. McLarty started preaching while he was a student at Harding. He preached for a couple of years in congregations around the Searcy area. Then he went on and got his master's degree at Harding University School in Theology in Memphis. Then his PhD later on. So anyway, we're happy to have Dr. McLarty. I think you'll find him to be well versed. He was a missionary in Kenya from 1984 to 1985. He also preached for the College Church in Searcy from 1991 to 2005. And then he served as vice president for spiritual life at Harding University from 2005 to 2013. Then became Harding's fifth president in 2013. He's been serving for 7 years as the president of Harding University, and I know that in these times and challenges, it's always difficult to be a president of any institution, particularly a Christian institution like Harding University. Again, we appreciate you listening. I think you'll find Dr. McLarty to be a very gifted and talented teacher and speaker, and I look forward to hear his presentation tonight. Immediately following his presentation, there will be announcements on the West Side, friends and family, immediately after Dr. McLarty's presentation. So tonight, let's enjoy a presentation from God's Word. Dr. McLarty.
Hello and greetings from the Harding University campus. I'm coming to you from the TV16 studios in the Reynolds building at Harding. This is move-in week as I'm filming this, and there's just more joy on campus than you can possibly imagine. I wish I could have made the trip to Russellville in person. I always enjoy the fellowship there when I get to be with you, but for this COVID year, the distance will just have to do it this way. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you. I love to be there and to talk about Harding University. So many of your students have come our way and have blessed us on campus. We have students once again from almost all 50 states and about 50 other countries. And we've had a lot of adjustments this year as we've gotten ready for a semester where we have face shields in class. We wear face coverings wherever we go, and we are committed to taking care of each other and our community in this unusual year of COVID-19. I want to share a message with you that has to do with seeing the world through the eyes of God. A few years ago, we had a lectureship on the Harding University campus, and I was asked to speak on the subject of the Good Samaritan. The whole lectureship was about these treasures of God that are found in the parables that are in the Gospels. And I was given the last night, and I was given the Good Samaritan. That sounds like just a fastball over the center of the plate. It's made to knock out of the park. One of the first things that I did when I was given the assignment was I went back to see what I had done in my years of preaching, 25 years in local ministry, and what had I done, how had I preached on the Good Samaritan before. I was absolutely shocked when I realized that though I had often made reference to the story of the Good Samaritan from Luke chapter 10, I had never once preached a sermon that was just on the Good Samaritan. I couldn't believe it. And so I plunged into this, doing fresh preparation for the message of what is this treasure from this truly, truly remarkable story. it proves to be a very easy task in that the story is so accessible, but it's also incredibly difficult because it defies mastery. Every time you think you've gotten your arms around this, there's something else in the richness of the story that springs to life, and you wonder, did I ever understand the story before at all? I want to begin with a reading of the text from Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. So, why is the story so incredibly compelling? As the story is set on the road to Jericho, Jericho is 17 miles east-northeast of Jerusalem. It's 10 miles north of the mouth of the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level. Jericho is 700 feet below sea level. It is the historic city of palms. So the story is told about this priest and this Levite who are going down from Jerusalem, and they're headed toward Jericho. And on the Jericho road, they happen upon a man who has been beaten and left for dead by robbers. And seeing him and seeing the problem and being afraid to get involved, they each walk by on the other side of the road. They're both spiritual leaders, and they both would have had some responsibilities at the temple. Coming from the temple, going to Jericho, they cross by on the other side of the road. And then in verse 33, the first word in that verse is shocking to the reader if we could experience this for the first time. If we could know what it was like to hear Jesus tell the story without knowing the ending of it. So we see the priest and the Levite go by on the other side of the road, and Jesus says then, but a Samaritan, the one word you were not expecting to hear, the Samaritan, the person of this race of mixed people from the exile who were despised by the Jews, people who were considered to be unclean from the time of their birth. But a Samaritan took care of the man and bound up his wounds and put him on his donkey and paid for his care at the end. I think it's a compelling story for one reason, is that we all see ourselves in this story. I think some of us see ourselves as being the victim here. beaten up, left for dead. Maybe it's that life has been tough on you. Maybe you feel beaten up by the devil himself. But all of us know what it's like to have times in our lives where we feel beaten up and badly in need of somebody showing compassion on us. We've all been there. I think we also see ourselves in the story, sometimes in the priest and the Levite. When we don't respond as we should, when we don't take advantage of an open door for ministry that God has given us, when there is somebody who needs our help or some group of people who are just waiting for us to deliver them from whatever it is they're struggling with, but we walk by on the other side. Maybe we're afraid. Maybe we don't want to get involved in the messiness of a situation, and we later regret it. And it bothers us. It bothers our conscience because we pass by on the other side of the road. Or maybe it's about the Good Samaritan himself. This is us at our very best. When God presents us with those opportunities for ministry, and somebody in our world is needing our help, and we give that help, and we bind up their wounds. Maybe we pay for their care. And at moments like that, don't we feel so in sync with the heart of God? Sometimes we're the person who's beaten up. Sometimes we're the priest of the Levite. Sometimes we are the Good Samaritan. Or maybe we're even like a little girl I heard about recently. Her Bible class had studied the Good Samaritan in Bible class, and at lunch, her grandfather, who's a good friend of mine, they were gathered, multiple generations of the family gathered at the table, and he always liked to ask the grandchildren, "What lesson did you learn in Bible class today?" And the little girl said, "We studied about the man who was hurt." And her grandfather, wanting to pull out, "What did you actually learn and all from this?" prodded her, and he said, "And who was the hero of the story?" And without missing a beat, his granddaughter replied, "The donkey." Maybe there's a time where even being the donkey in the story is a good place to be. Fred Craddock is a preacher and a writer in the field of preaching, and he warns preachers about preaching on texts like the Good Samaritan. And he says, be careful because there's this temptation, the temptation for the minister who boils off all the water and preaches the stain at the bottom of the cup. I don't want to do that with this story. I don't want to reduce it to three things that we learn from the Good Samaritan and act as though we have completely mastered the story. But instead, I would like for our approach on this occasion to be like a beautiful gem. Has all kinds of facets, and every time that you turn it a little bit, the light hits it differently, and you see new colors, and you see new beauty. I want to leave you, when we have finished this study, I want to leave you still turning the gem of the Good Samaritan story and seeing how the light hits it from a number of different directions. It all starts in the text as the lawyer stands up in verse 25 to put him to the test. And so there's something we see about this man. One is that this is not a sincere God seeker. This is not a humble person who is saying, "Please give me truth and I will walk in it." But instead we see that he is, in verse 25, the word that's used is, he came to test Jesus by what he said, trying to trick him in this question. And then in verse 29, after he's answered at first, and Jesus says, "You've answered correctly, do this and you'll live." Then in verse 29, but desiring to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And again, he doesn't seem to be a person who is a humble God seeker, but someone who is quite full of himself, and someone who is wanting to test Jesus and justify himself. And at the end of the text, when Jesus asked him, which of these people proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? In verse 37, he said, the one who showed him mercy. It's as if he couldn't bring himself to say, the Samaritan. And so he just said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus refused to answer the wrong question in this text. Jesus so often has questioners, and he knows, and we see it consistently in the Gospels, he knows that a good answer to the wrong question still leaves you in the wrong place. A good answer to the wrong question still leaves us in the wrong place. And so often Jesus would refuse to answer the question that was brought to him. But instead, Jesus, and it must have perplexed and maybe driven mad the people who first asked him those questions, Jesus would answer what he knew was the right question. And so he does in this text. Jesus knows that this man is saying, so who is my neighbor? And what that means is, I want you to tell me who my neighbor is so that I can limit the demands of God on my life. I can say, okay, well then I will love that much, but I don't have to love any more than that. Frederick Buechner, in his book Wishful Thinking, writes that since the man was a lawyer, he said, I can imagine his answering his own question something like this. Who is my neighbor? A neighbor, hereinafter referred to as the party of the first part, is to be construed as meaning the person of Jewish descent whose legal residence is within a radius of no more than 3 statute miles from one's own legal residence, unless there is another person of Jewish descent, hereinafter referred to as the party of the second part, living closer to the party of the first part than one is oneself, in which case the party of the second part is to be construed as neighbor to the party of the first part, and one is oneself relieved of all responsibility of any sort or kind whatever. We know that's absurd, and yet it seems to be in the spirit of the person who came and asked Jesus this question. You see, who is my neighbor is the wrong question. Grieven in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament said, one cannot define one's neighbor. One can only be a neighbor. Or Darrell Bach said in a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, said, neighbors can come from surprising places. I think we could also add that faith and virtue and kingdom heroes can come from surprising places. I had a Good Samaritan moment in my life a few years ago. In January of that year, I'd been to Washington, D.C. in a number of conferences for university presidents. And one of the sessions was conducted by the public relations team from the Emory University Hospital. It was fascinating. Emory University Hospital was the place that they had brought Dr. Kent Brantley, the Ebola doctor, when he was evacuated from Liberia with Ebola. And in that presentation, they told of how Emory University Hospital had trained for years for such a moment. And there is a handful of hospitals like Emory across the nation that are prepared for things like pandemics, where you bring someone there and they know the protocols and they do full dress rehearsals all the time, getting ready for a day when someone like Dr. Brantley needs to be brought to the hospital in the States. But when they did this, when word got out that Brantley had been brought to Emory University Hospital for treatment, social media erupted with fear and with fury. For 2 weeks, Emory University Hospital took a beating in social media. And people were saying things like, those missionaries chose to go to Africa, they deserve to die. Sort of like the priest and the Levite walking by on the other side of the road. The month after I had heard that presentation, we had Dr. Kent Brantley on the Harding University campus as an American Studies Institute speaker. The Benson Auditorium was absolutely packed. He told us that night, holding the entire place spellbound with his story. He told us of how he had gone to Liberia to help with the Ebola crisis, that they were using the very best protocols for protecting the medical personnel who were working with these people. And he said we weren't being sloppy at all. But the hospital where he was working with Ebola, there was an Ebola section, and then there was another section that was sort of for all kinds of emergencies that got brought in. And he told of how that one night he had gone from the Ebola section and had fully scrubbed up and all, and had gone over into the non-Ebola section and had spent the night trying desperately to save two women who were having babies. And that night they both died. And he's convinced that it was on the non-Ebola side of the hospital that he contracted Ebola. He told of how when he became sick, how that he just immediately, all of his energy left and he was absolutely helpless. He told of how the nurses, after a day or two, had to diaper him. He told of how he called his parents and his siblings to say goodbye. It wasn't to say that I'm sick, but at that time Ebola was a death sentence. And he called and they wept, and he told them that he was probably about to die. He then told about how he had blood transfusions for 3 days. The first day the blood came from the blood bank at the hospital. The second day it was from one of his co-workers. But I was sitting there listening to that presentation that night, and my Good Samaritan moment came at this point. He told us of how that on the third day the blood transfusion came from a 14-year-old boy who had survived Ebola himself. And he said, and he was a Muslim. And I remember feeling like someone had just hit me in the chest with those words. It was a Good Samaritan moment. When he said that in the Benson Auditorium, it was just like people hearing Jesus say, and then a Samaritan came down the road, binding up his wounds and pouring on oil and wine. If we are blinded to the truth, we will miss some of God's greatest lessons for us in our lives. In 2005, my wife and I went to Harding University in Greece, one of our 7 semester abroad programs at Harding University. Students oftentimes speak of their experiences at programs like this as the highlight of their college days. My wife we've each taught a couple of classes, and one of the classes that my wife taught was Foundations of Education. It's commonly referred to as Ed-Fed. And as she was preparing for this, she went and was trained by one of the teachers here on campus. And one of them had given her extensive notes, and one of the things that came out of educational theory was that good educators give people folders for their brains. That when a teacher teaches a lesson and does it well, you have a new folder to put information in for the rest of your life. And so if you're teaching an English class about the subjunctive in the English language, something maybe people have never heard about before, but for the rest of their lives, when they hear the subjunctive, they have a folder for that. Otherwise, that information would just fall to the floor, and you wouldn't build up a body of information, and you wouldn't grow in your thinking. So the question is, do you have a folder for that? And one of the ideas of being a good teacher is helping people develop new folders for their brains. In the Gospel of Luke, we see Jesus was doing this constantly. As Jesus was saying to people and was teaching people that there's a folder that you probably don't have. For instance, Mary, the mother of Jesus, an unwed peasant girl Do you expect to see anything of kingdom values? Do you expect to see heroes of faith in somebody like her? And she's one who said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." Do you have a folder for an unwed peasant girl who can show kingdom greatness? Or then there was Levi at a tax booth, a tax collector, someone that Jews considered a Jew who has made himself a Gentile. And we find that Jesus says to him, "Follow me," and that he left everything and came to follow Jesus. In Luke chapter 7, there is the centurion, a Gentile soldier of an occupation Roman army. He asked Jesus to come and heal his servant who was at the point of death. When Jesus was not far from his house, the man sent a message and said, "Don't come to my house. I know that for a Jew that would be problematic for you." But he said, "I'm a man who understands authority." And he said, "Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." To have compassion for a servant, to humble himself before Jesus, to show confidence in Jesus' ability to heal even at a distance. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and he turned to the crowd that followed him and said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." The sinful woman in Luke chapter 7 with the alabaster vial of ointment. Jesus said, "I tell you that her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much." The woman with the 12-year issue of blood. And at the end of the story, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." In Luke chapter 17, the story of the 10 lepers. And remember, in that story, it's a Samaritan once again who is the hero. And Jesus said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus, another tax collector, probably the most hated man in Jericho. And Zacchaeus, when Jesus goes to his house, Zacchaeus stands up and he says to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham." And then one of the high points in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23 and verse 47, the centurion who is at the cross. Once again, someone who is a soldier in an occupation army that would have been hated by the Jewish race. And yet this man has one of the best lines in the entire Gospel of Luke. When he saw what had taken place at the cross, he praised God, saying, "Certainly, this man was innocent." And then to top it all off, in the book of Acts, which is Luke volume 2, in Acts 1 verse 8, Jesus says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." There's a lot of spiritual blindness in the world today because we simply don't have folders. We don't have folders for some important things that we need to see. I believe that the essence of bigotry and racism is that I don't have a folder for any of the good things that at least some of the people of a particular group do. I've brought some folders with me on this occasion. And so before we wrap the lesson up, I'd like for us to think about these folders. I have one here that is for good men. Maybe a folder that some women who watch this need and don't have. Maybe because you've been hurt or betrayed by men. But you need a folder for good men because they are all around. I have a folder for good women that may be men who have had terrible experiences with some of the women in their lives. Maybe you need this folder and didn't realize that you didn't have one. I have a folder here that says Good White People. And some people who have been hurt and carry those hurts in their hearts may not have this folder and may need it. Just as there is a need for a folder for good black people. A folder for good Democrats. Have you got one of those? And for the other people, a folder for good Republicans. A folder for good immigrants. A folder for good police officers. A folder for good prisoners. A folder for good politicians. A folder for some for good rich people. And for others, good poor people. A folder for good educated people. A folder for good uneducated people. You get the idea. Jesus, in the story of the Good Samaritan, asks us the question, do you have a folder for that? And his hearers did not. Maybe they had a folder for good Jews, or for good priests, or for good Levites, maybe good victims. But the idea of a good Samaritan, it was beyond them. At the end of the story, Jesus said, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. And I think that's the best conclusion for a message on the story of the Good Samaritan, is to leave us with the words of Jesus. You go and do likewise. Thank you.